So g'day everyone, welcome to another Bush Creek fly tying tutorial. In this tutorial I'm tying up this fly, which is my Freckle, the Freckle fly. Basically this is a pattern that I pulled together to try and get a small pattern fly, so a small fly, deeper down. So basically looking at oversizing the bead on it to get it a bit further down. It's a pretty straightforward fly to tie. It gets a little bit fiddly because you tie it in small sizes, but it is a fairly simple fly to do. You can keep it in, this one's in a brown. The other colour scheme that I usually tie it in is with a copper bead and some golden olive body materials. But this one we're tying in brown. You could try different types of materials, I guess, or different types of colour schemes. It's pretty straightforward to tie, so we'll get on into it. So the hook I'm using is a Daihuku jig hook in size 18, which is about the standard size that I use for this particular fly. You can tie it a bit smaller, but it gets a little bit more fiddly, and it's a bit bigger, and you might as well just use a different type of fly. So size 18 usually does the trick. The bead is a offset bead or a jig off bead, whichever way you want to describe it. And what this does is, between this and tying it in, allows you to put an oversized bead on a very small hook. And there's a video on the channel that talks specifically about offset beads, or how I use offset beads, but we'll cover it here anyway. So what I've got in the vise is the hook and the offset bead, and I've just taken the bead off and let it sit to the back for the time being. The thread I use is Semperfli Nano Silk. This one I'm using in black. You can sort of use whatever colour you like, but I'm using black in this. It needs to be a fairly strong and thin thread, so that you can get into the tight spots and give yourself, and it doesn't build up a body. So to start with, I'm going to catch on the thread, and at this point I'm just simply going to secure the thread and then trim away the waste material. Once I've done that, I'm just going to advance my thread around to the elbow and do a turn or so around the elbow, so that the thread is basically sort of halfway between the bend in the elbow and in here. Bend in the elbow in here and the eye of the hook. And then what I'm then going to do is I'm going to bring my bead forward, and whilst sort of holding my bead in position, I'm going to come around behind the bead and back down onto the shank. And that turn starts to position and orientate the bead into the correct position for me. And that's sort of holds it there. And then from here, what I'm simply going to do is I'm going to do a figure of 8 with a few full turns onto the shank and onto the hook to secure the bead in place. You don't need a lot. 6 or 7 turns is probably usually enough. So what that does is, by doing the figure 8, it holds the bead in position, secures it, and it's gel spun polymer, so it's a fairly strong thread in the first instance. And then what you'll end up with is, just here underneath the bead, in the bend of the elbow here, is a crisscross of thread, which is what secures and locks the bead in place. And that's what you're looking for. So the bead's here, it's in position. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just come back down the hook, and I'm going to come back to the bend, to about the point where you'd be sitting with a barb. So the tail material for this, I use silver pheasant. This one dyed brown olive. I use this for the tailing materials, and all I'm going to do is, probably 4 or 5 fibres, and I'm just going to pull them away at right angles to the shaft, and then just tear or trim them away, and they become your tail material. Tail length is about the length of the shank. It's usually around about the second bar of black that comes in on a feather, and I'm just going to do a turn or so to hold it in position. Make sure that they're square and on top of the shank. From here, just going to tie in back down towards the bead, and I'm just using the rest of the tail fibres to help build up some body. to the fly, back to the bead, and then I'm going to trim away the waste. From here, I come back down the shank to the base of the tail. And this is where I'm going to tie in my next material, which is goose bite. So I'm using brown goose bite. The material I'm using is Semperfli's Inferno goose bite in brown. Of course, you use whatever colour you choose to use. Now, I'm going to tie this in by the tip. The important part with tying in the bite is understanding that how this looks. So you'll have one tapered edge, in this case it's orientated down, where there'll be a small, very fine divot. Sorry, it's a bit hard to see because of my fingers. But it essentially, the shape of the bite gives the impression of it being, say, I guess you could say a knife is the easiest way to describe it. You'll have this fine edge along here, and then you'll have a thicker, darker edge, which is clearly where the herl on the bite sits. What you want to do is tie that in so that that finer edge here is down and the bite fibres are at the top. Now, in aid in turning, tying in this and using the bite, it's handy to have it moist. So I usually use a little bit of saliva just to moisten the fibre itself, or the bite itself, so that it softens up a little bit. Makes it a little bit easier to use and less likely to sort of break on you, particularly at the tip. So I'm just going to catch this in at the tip. You probably want to do as close to the tip as you possibly can. I'll come in with the tip, I catch that in with a turn, and then I'm just going to secure that down, back down to the base of the tail, and then from here I'm just wrapping back up to the bead. Okay, we've got the bite in. I come in with a small pair of hackle pliers. I'm going to catch the base of the bite, and then just taking my time, I'm just going to wrap that bite up in touching turns, building up the body. It doesn't have to be super thick. I'm just going to use that bite up basically until I get to the back of the bead. Now, sometimes you might not. Depends on the length of your bite. In this case, I'm probably a little bit shy, but that'll be all right. And I'm just going to catch that bite in and secure it in with several turns. Once I've done that, I'm going to come in and trim away the waist of this bite. And get a little bit nippy, but depends on how fine your scissors are. It doesn't matter if you don't get all of it, because the next step solves that problem. If you need to, another couple of turns just to secure that down. So the final material for this is essentially a blend of hairs, dubbing and SLF. So the dubbing mix is equal parts natural hairs mask, brown olive dyed hairs mask, and chocolate SLF, prism SLF. And this is the reason the fly is called a freckle, because the colours that the SLF, the chocolate SLF, pull out, when I started tying this fly, reminded me of one of the lollies that I used to have when I was a kid, and that's hence why it's called the freckle. So that's the dubbing mix, equal parts. So whatever you need to do, natural hairs mask, brown olive hairs mask, and chocolate SLF. Okay, so to do the dubbing, what I'm going to do is essentially split the thread, and then just do split thread method for the dubbing. Now you don't need a lot, but you do need some dubbing in there. So I'll just come in with my bobbin, needle, and split this thread, and then I'm going to take some pinches of this dubbing mix and get it into this thread. Now, you need to be, well, you don't want to be too skimpy, but you need to be, you don't want to be too generous either, because you're only going to do a few turns. So So you don't need to get carried away. You probably want about that much, which I guess is, let's say, about an inch, 2 centimetres, 2.5 centimetres of dubbing, a couple of pinches. And once I've got that secured in, all I'm going to do is rethread or respin my thread and create a fairly tight but bushy dubbing noodle. So from here, once I've got the dubbing in, I'm going to go around the back of the bead once. I'm going to come underneath the bead and around behind the eye. I'm going to go back around behind the bead, and I'm going to come back around behind the eye, and that is the position, and that's the dubbing done. From here, and this is I guess is the handy part of this, one of the key things you're going to need a rotary vise or something, is I'm just going to rotate that vise up, and then I'm going to do 2 or 3 turns behind the eye to secure, and then come in with my whip finisher and do 2 or 3 turns of whip finish directly behind the eye, and another couple just to be sure, and we're done. From here I trim away my thread, and that is the freckle done. Draw the fibres away, that's not necessary, but that's excuse me, is the fly done, and that is the freckle. If some of those fibres seem to be too long, then you can come in and trim away, although I don't usually bother unless it is really crazy long. But by and large, a little bit bushy, a little bit shiny, and very small with a fair bit of weight. So 3.3 millimeter offset bead, so it's got a fair bit of weight to this fly. That's the freckle. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. Hopefully if you give it a try, it works for you. Take care, tight lines.